One of my favorite things to paint in watercolor is clouds and skies. And today I'm going to be showing you how I paint these clouds. Here is a look at the reference for this painting. I snapped this photo in the evening and the sun was kind of heading down, but the main thing that got my attention were the clouds in the sky. So the first thing I do, as always, is I lay in my drawing. And you'll notice since the sky is featured more in this painting, I've lowered my horizon line below that halfway point to leave more room for the sky up here. The first thing I do is wet down the back of my painting and the front of my painting, and this is really helpful when painting skies because that'll give us more time to work wet into wet, and the sky is all going to be painted in this first wet into wet wash. The first thing that I do is I lay in some light color for the clouds. We are going to be negatively painting around the clouds. So I use a little bit of lavender, a touch of neutral tint, maybe some raw sienna, a light warm wash to lay in the lighter area of the clouds. And now I'm taking away the white of the paper, still working wet into wet, and this is really light. You can probably barely see this in the video. But while I'm working wet into wet, that's a good time for me to get some subtle value changes that have soft edges. Notice how I'm adding in some of the softer transitions in the cloud, these little bits of variation. And that adds some believability to the cloud. The sky just isn't blue for the sky, white for the cloud. There are a lot of little subtle, softer value changes and color changes within the shape of the cloud. Okay, once I've laid in the cloud, I'm going to negatively paint around the cloud to define the white part of the cloud. So I have some blue on my brush, some cobalt blue and some cerulean, and I'm going to paint around the cloud and start to give the cloud a little bit of definition. So this is where watercolor timing comes into play. I don't want to go in with a really fully loaded brush and just wash away what I've already laid in on this wash. The paper is damp and I need to move forward carefully in order to preserve the white cloud that is very important to me in this painting. And I'm adding a little more of these little value changes. I'm bringing some of the blue down in here. All the while, I'm being very careful around this big white cloud. And at this point, you can already see the sky is starting to come to life. I have the value for the cloud, a little bit of blue, and even right now, things are starting to happen. So one thing I'm doing here is I switched to a different brush. I'm not using my large brush. I'm using this medium round brush that holds less water and less paint. And the reason I want to use this brush instead is because, like I mentioned, I don't want too much water during this time of the painting, because I don't want to just wash away what I've already done here and just get a big bloom flowing down the paper. So what I'm doing is I have more paint and less water on this brush, and I'm carefully painting around the white part of the cloud to give it some definition. But these wonderful lost edges and the softness, all that can be achieved when we can learn to paint wet into wet and really be careful and be observant of what's going on in the paper. How damp is the paper? So when it's completely wet, I wouldn't be able to get these little defined edges. So I have to wait till the paper is still damp but not dry. See, I can carefully add some blue around this cloud, these little bits of broken up shapes where there's lost and found edges. All that really helps to create a believable feeling for your sky. Okay, we'll zip ahead a little bit. Now I'm using that same brush and I've added a little bit of neutral tint to my blue mixture, and I want to show the underside of that cloud and really give this cloud some form so it really feels three-dimensional. I needed to do some underside of the cloud to give it a little more definition. But painting skies in this way is a great practice in watercolor timing and in color mixing. And I always say this to my students: if you don't have time to do a full, complete painting, do a sky study. It's going to work. You're going to work on so many important skills and develop a good feeling for watercolor timing if you can do some exercises like this where you're just practicing skies and not worrying about completing a whole painting. All right, we are really close to being done with this sky. I put a little more paint on my brush, and put a little more value and strength on the underside of the cloud here. And now I'm moving on into my wet wash, putting in some of the lighter areas on the ground, and I'm done with the sky and I'm ready to move into the rest of the painting. So I'll show you what that looks like as well. As I'm moving down the paper, there are a couple bits of white that I wanted to preserve to really see that light that's hitting the side of those houses. And I did dampen the entire paper, but by the time I was done with the sky and started moving down, I was able to get that more defined white edge, or that harder edge and defined part of the paper to show the light really shining on the side of those buildings. And as I move down into the ground, I'm really adding a lot more paint. A lot of times I see in students' work, they're really afraid to go strong on this first wash, but don't be afraid to use a lot of paint and really get a nice rich mixture. This is what it looks like after my paper has dried. And now that's when we get into the middle value connected shape of the scene. And those trees around the house are a great tool for us to negatively paint around the houses to really get that feeling of light on them. So I've started over on the left side of my paper and I'm working my way across the scene, being careful to negatively paint around the houses and the bits of light that are important to me. And now I can tie in some of the shadow side and some of the fence lines and other things right into the shape of these trees. And while the trees are still damp, I'm taking a smaller brush and adding a few little darks. It's nice to drop in some darks into the trees while it's still damp because you get a nice soft edge on those areas. And you can see here I've scratched out a few little fence posts with my fingernail, and that'll give us a little bit of light and interest down in this part of the painting. As much as I can, I'm trying to find little bits of value to connect back into the shape of this tree. So see these little bits of shadow on the houses, little bits here. You'd be surprised how far that little touch of detail will go to help this read like a house. And by finding ways to connect bits of the house into the shape of the tree, it's helping to create more of a unified feeling to the painting. Before these trees have dried, I'm taking a little palette knife and I'm scratching in a few little branches, a little bit of detail into that shape while it's still wet. And down here, I need a little more value and a little more interest right here in the foreground. So I'm using more of this green color, this Cobalt Turquoise and raw sienna, to give myself some texture down here at the bottom part of the painting. Because I do want this to read closer to us and bring that area forward. And one way to bring an area forward is by giving it some texture. And I'm pulling that green up and I'm leaving little bits of this lighter green color just to help the painting feel more interesting down in this part. And I wanted a few little fence posts there to give us some bit of interest here in the middle ground. The fence acts as a nice little directional line to lead us into the scene. And here is a look at the final painting. So by really taking your time and by practicing painting wet into wet and negatively painting around clouds, you can really create some wonderful lifelike skies. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? You ever had that experience? Well, I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone, you could print it out, and you can take a look at these crucial planning steps before you start each painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.